present For the Record.
Welcome to For the Record. I'm Naomi Coles. In a ruling that could spell Wisconsin's political future for the next 10 years or more, Wisconsin's state Supreme Court ruled Tuesday that they would minimize changes to the state's current election maps. Now, that effectively guarantees a Republican majority in the legislature for years to come. I'm joined by University of Wisconsin Law School Associate Professor Robert Yaglon to explain what all this means. Robert, thanks so much for joining me today.
Happy to talk to you.
So let's start with the basics. Why is the Supreme Court dictating this to begin with?
Well, under the Wisconsin Constitution, the political branches of the state, beginning with the legislature, have the first opportunity to draw new electoral maps every 10 years. But the political branches reached an impasse. The legislature passed a map. It was a map that looked a lot like the current gerrymandered maps. From the start, the governor said that he would veto such a map, and he did. And now, because the legislature hasn't done the job, it falls to the courts, because every decade it is necessary to get a new set of maps as populations change, as circumstances change. The law is that maps should be adapted as well.
So when we think about the ruling, what was the rationale for the majority of the justices here explaining that they wouldn't consider political parties when making map decisions?
Right. Well, this was a 4-3 decision from the Wisconsin Supreme Court. And what the four justices who embraced a so-called least change approach, one that uses the existing maps as the touchstone, what they said is that because the legislature has primacy in this area, the court should look to the last work that the legislature did on this topic. And that was the maps that they passed 10 years ago. And according to the majority, it is thus appropriate to use those maps as a starting point, even though those maps are, as Wisconsinites are well aware, quite aggressively gerrymandered.
So how far into the future does this kind of decision go? Is it just the next 10 years until the next map cycle, or does it go even longer?
Well, the new maps that the court is going to adopt, and the decision that it issued this week, doesn't actually pick a specific map. It just lays out the criteria that the court is now going to use in the coming months to pick a map. The map that the court adopts will be the map, presumptively, for the next decade. And because this is a decision from the Wisconsin Supreme Court, its decision is a precedent-setting decision. And so to the extent that in future decades this matter returns to the Wisconsin Supreme Court, that court, unless it were to overrule this precedent, would similarly presumably take a least change approach.
So is there any chance that a higher court steps in, that it gets appealed, that we eventually are talking about federal courts here?
Well, there are really just two ways that you might have federal court involvement. One is that it is still possible that the Wisconsin Supreme Court could decide to punt on this. They are indicating that they intend to draw maps, but in previous decades, in the 1980s, the 1990s, the 2000s, it was federal courts in Wisconsin rather than state courts that did this work. And so if the state Supreme Court reaches an impasse, or they decide that for the sake of their own institutional integrity, it would be better to have someone else do this work, it is conceivable that the maps could still be drawn by a federal court. Even if the Wisconsin Supreme Court does draw these maps, there might also be a more limited role for the federal courts to play, to the extent that there remain disputed federal law issues. But when it comes to Wisconsin law, what the Wisconsin Supreme Court comes up with here is really the bottom line.
What are the next steps here when we're talking about this litigation?
So what we're going to see next is that by December 15th, the court has instructed the parties to submit proposed maps that comply with the criteria that the court set out in its order this week. And that includes maps that are rooted as much as possible in the existing map. Then in January, the court plans to hold hearing and argument on those proposals. And it's at that point that the court will decide which specific map it will choose. All
right, Robert, thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, happy to do it.
All right, when we come back, the inside story of a murder-for-hire plot. I talked to the local journalist who helped track it. Welcome back to For the Record. A murder-for-hire federal court case rocked Dane County and made national headlines earlier this year. A woman has since been convicted and sentenced for paying Bitcoin to hire someone on the dark web to kill her ex-husband, then in Sun Prairie. Now, we knew then that it was journalists that uncovered the plot. Court filings later said it was the BBC and a local reporter. Now, a brief note here, the BBC is no longer involved with this project. Now, this week, we learned the name of the local journalist who helped them and the inside story of how it all went down. He joins me now, the Isthmus senior reporter, Dylan Brogan. Dylan, thanks for joining me today.
My pleasure.
Tell me how you found yourself knocking on a strange door in Sun Prairie back in January this year.
My dad thought it was a terrible idea because I was basically the job, right, was to knock on this stranger's door in Sun Prairie and tell him that somebody, nobody knew who, had paid Bitcoin to hire a hitman to kill him. And it actually went fairly well, given all those circumstances, I guess. He was polite, but, kind of politely tell me to get lost. But a few hours later, I think things sunk in, and he invited us back, and I connected them with this group of international journalists that are working on this global investigation that just happened to end up in Sun Prairie, Wisconsin.
Now, is this a real threat? It starts with them paying this, the group of journalists you're working with, they pay this money, or they don't, but they hear about this happening. Is this threat real?
These dark web assassin websites are usually scams. In fact, all the ones that I've heard of are scams. But the motivation behind people paying money to hire an assassin, that's what's real. So there are other cases around the country that, this was kind of like the first step into other actions to hurt people. So it's the motivation is real, but no, these sites are set up to take money from people.
And that was kind of why you end up at this man's door, right?
Yes.
Because there's a real threat. There's not a hitman coming, but there's a threat. So how do you convince him that there's a threat? How does that conversation go?
Well, I opened the door, and he basically told me I had 10 seconds to spit out this kind of preposterous story. So I did my very best to explain. And in a weird way, though, he wasn't that surprised because he had been going through this horrendous ordeal with his ex-wife for so long that kind of incredible things didn't seem kind of routine to him at this point. And, that's kind of where the story started to unravel, and then we learned a lot more about just this, really tragic custody case that he was involved with his ex-wife in.
So let's dig into his background a little bit before we continue talking about what happens next.
Sure.
Where do we get to? Who's threatening him, and how did they get to that point?
Well, all we knew, and this is what I was hired to do as a freelancer, was to contact this person. All we knew is that an individual who turned out to be Kelly Harper, we didn't know that at the time, had twice tried to pay Bitcoin money to hire this assassin and had provided his personal details, where he lived, his license plate number, things like so you could find him. She had been scammed once and said she had been scammed, and yet she went on the dark web again to try to hire another assassin online. So once Travis, sort of the shock of it, and his name is Travis Harper, once the shock of that initial conversation and things started to sink in, I think he did want to learn more. And the journalists I was working for, I was able to connect with them and Travis via Zoom, and they sort of walked him through the whole thing. And then we called the Sun Prairie Police, and that's sort of where the next chapter of this all began.
So let's start with that next chapter. How did the local police initially respond, and then who kind of comes in later?
Well, the Sun Prairie Police arrive, and this is just what Travis told me at the time. They kind of listened to this story and got our contact info. They weren't there for very long, and they pulled Travis aside, and what he told me later was that, he thought that I was there to scam him, and that, maybe consider that possibility. But I wasn't, and the FBI was contacted the next morning by someone close to Travis, and the Sun Prairie Police then began cooperating, and the FBI took this extremely seriously, and 6 weeks later, his ex was arrested, and she was sentenced in October or end of September to basically 6 years in prison.
So that involves a lot of already reported information. We've seen the headlines. It made national news as murder for hire in Sun Prairie. Tell me what it was like for you as you watched these headlines unfold to know, yeah, I'm that local journalist. What's going through your mind as this story goes through court?
You know, this may be a cliche, but like we journalists don't really want to be part of the story, but this was kind of just like a freelance job that sounded interesting to me, and at various moments I sort of regretted. It seemed like, what the heck am I getting myself into? You know, one thing that's not in the story was like, you know, it took a few times of me trying to find him in his house when he was home. You know, there was at one point I arrived and he was just pulling out, so I ended up following him on the interstate for a few things before I'm like, what the heck am I doing here? I should probably just try again later because I don't want him to think I was following him. So there was some funny moments like that. But yeah, no, in this group of journalists I was working with, I mean, they had no idea either whether somebody wants him killed. Was he involved in something that was dangerous or something, or was he violent? And none of that turned out to be true. He just was involved in this crazy custody battle, trying to see his kids.
I think as journalists, we often find ourselves in weird or random or sometimes scary situations, and I think this might take the cake for at least local stories that I know of.
Well, it all turned out okay, and he's grateful that, you know, we contacted him and told him about this. And you know, there are dark web sites that this group of international journalists are not monitoring and don't have access to, right? And what would have happened if we didn't contact him? That's what he worries about, and he's still very paranoid about like how the lengths in which his ex went to harm him.
Yeah, it's a scary story, and I think also just knowing, you know, what happens next. Now, normally I would send my viewers to channel3000.com to, you know, recap these conversations on For the Record, but what I want you also to do is go to isthmus.com, read Dylan's story, every word of it for yourself. It is a wild ride that you will not regret. Thanks for joining us today. Have a safe and healthy week.